Okay, so now let's go through a step-by-step approach for understanding attribute sampling in a simplified language using the invoice approval process at Accrual World as an example. Okay, so step one is going to be setting the objective. First, we need to know what it is that we're testing. So in this case, Detective Lucy wants to check whether invoices at Accrual World are being properly approved before they are paid. Okay, so we are looking for and ultimately trying to understand where things were done incorrectly by Accrual World. She's not looking at the amounts just yet. Okay, so just whether somebody signed off like they were supposed to. In step two, we need to now define the population. So now we figure out where Lucy is picking from. That's the full list of invoices processed during the year at Accrual World. This is the entire group she'll be sampling from. In step three, we now need to identify the sampling unit. And this just means what is each individual item that we'll be checking. In this case, each invoice is one unit. So when she selects samples, she'll be choosing individual invoices to inspect. And in step four, we're going to identify the attribute. So next, Lucy needs to define exactly what counts as a problem. She might flag invoices that weren't approved before being paid, didn't have the proper documents, or were paid without following company rules. So these are the kind of red flags that she'll be watching out for in her sample. So in step five, we now need to determine the sample size. So this is how Lucy figures out how many invoices she needs to check. So a few things will impact this number. So the first factor is risk of assessing control risk too low. So this is the risk she's willing to accept. And it's going to have an inverse relationship with sample size, aka the more risk, the smaller the sample. Okay, so if there's greater risk accepted, this will lead to a smaller sample size. It just means that she's okay missing a few more of these issues. The next factor is the tolerable deviation rate. All right, so you could think of this as the tolerable error rate. How much error is she willing to accept? And this will also have an inverse relationship with sample size. Okay, so more tolerance will lead to a smaller sample and less work. All right, so more deviations tolerated are going to lead to that smaller sample size. Why? Because if she's okay with more mistakes, she doesn't need to check as many invoices. And then finally, we have the expected deviation rate. So you could think of this as the expected error rate. All right, so this is going to have a direct relationship with sample size. In other words, the more expected errors, the larger the sample. All right, so this will just basically mean that she'll want to check more if she suspects more problems. So take note that if there are thousands of invoices, it doesn't necessarily mean that Lucy has to test thousands in her sample. The sample size usually doesn't increase once population is very large, such as more than 5,000 invoices.
What's going on? My name is Joey and I'm the founder of Universal CPA Review. You're probably here because you're ready to pass the CPA exams once and for all so that you can advance in your career and move on with your life. Let me be the first to tell you that I've been there and I feel your pain. But I'm also here to tell you that the CPA exam doesn't have to feel like such a maze, and there is a path to a passing score. So what are you waiting for? Don't waste any more time. Commit to the process because it will pay off. In my opinion, I say let's knock out the CPA exams once and for all.
So in step six, we now need to select the sample. All right, so now it's time for Detective Lucy to actually choose which invoices she's going to review. She can't just pick any group of invoices that are easy to grab, like the first 10 on the list, or all from the same day. That's called block sampling, and it's not allowed because it might miss patterns or problems that happen in parts or other parts of the year or across different types of invoices. All right, so how should Lucy choose? Well, she needs to pick her invoices using one of these approved methods. So we have random sampling and systematic sampling. Random sampling is when every invoice has an equal chance of being picked. We're just randomly selecting the invoices, like pulling numbers out of a hat. Whereas systematic sampling is picking every X invoice from the full list, such as every 50th invoice, after randomly choosing a starting point. So why is this important? Well, it helps make sure that the sample truly represents the whole population. If Lucy only looks at the first 10 invoices from January, she might miss mistakes that happen in other months, or only test invoices processed by one staff member. By using a random or systematic approach, Lucy can feel more confident that the sample she checks gives a fair picture of whether Accrual World's approval process is really working. So now we can evaluate the sample results. So this is where Detective Lucy analyzes what she found in her audit sample. She wants to answer the big question: can I trust this control, or is there too much risk that it's not working properly? To figure that out, she uses this formula. So the sample deviation rate plus the allowance for sampling risk will equal the upper deviation rate. So the upper deviation rate is your best guess at the worst case scenario. Okay, so think of it like this. You're checking a small portion of a big group to see how many things are wrong. But because you're not checking everything, you leave a cushion, just in case your small sample didn't show the full picture. All right, so it tells you, even though I only found a few problems, there could be more that I didn't catch. So here's the highest error rate that I might reasonably expect within the whole group. All right, so the sample deviation rate is what Lucy actually found. So this is the percentage of invoices in her sample that had errors. It's based on real data from the invoices that she reviewed. So let's say if Lucy reviews 75 invoices and finds 2 errors, then her sample deviation rate is calculated as 2 divided by 75, which is 2.67%. All right, so that means that 2.67% of the sample had problems. Whereas the allowance for sampling risk is a safety margin in case Lucy's sample didn't show all the errors. So it accounts for the chance that the actual error rate in the full population is higher than what she saw. So think of the allowance for sampling risk as sort of this built-in cushion. It's like saying, even if I didn't find many errors, there could still be more that I didn't see. So I'll pad my number just in case. All right, so think of it sort of like this buffer zone in case she got lucky and picked a sample that doesn't represent the whole population. So let's go ahead and say that her allowance for sampling risk is 3.5%. Now Lucy calculates her upper deviation rate as 2.67% plus 3.5% to give her a 6.17% upper deviation rate. That means Lucy is 95% confident that the real error rate in the full invoice population is no more than 6.17%. So now what Lucy's going to do is compare her upper deviation rate to the tolerable deviation rate. Think of the tolerable deviation rate as the highest error rate that she's okay with before deciding this control doesn't work. So if the upper deviation rate is less than the tolerable deviation rate, that means that the control is working well enough for her. Whereas if the upper deviation rate is greater than the tolerable rate, that'll tell her that the control isn't reliable and Lucy can't trust it and will need to do more audit work. All right, so in summary, the sample deviation rate is the percentage of actual errors in what Lucy reviewed. So in this case, it's 2 out of 75, which is 2.67%. The allowance for sampling risk is that cushion that's added to account for possible unseen errors. So we slapped a 3.5% cushion. And finally, the upper deviation rate is the final percentage used to judge the control. So we're just adding the sample deviation rate of 2.67% and the allowance for sampling risk of 3.5% to give us 6.17%. All right, so she's adding these two together to get that upper deviation rate, which is her best estimate of the worst case scenario in the full population. All right, so once again, if that upper deviation rate is less than or equal to the tolerable limit, then she could say, okay, controls are working. But if it's more, then she knows she can't trust the control and needs to do more digging. Okay, and in the planning phase of the audit engagement, the whole idea here is understanding the client's system of internal controls. And something you might get tested on or could be included within a question could be the indication that understanding the client's internal controls is enough. And that's never going to be the correct answer choice, because the auditor must also test those internal controls to properly evaluate their design and implementation. And we're going to do this when we've determined that the design and implementation are not operating effectively, or because sufficient evidence may not be obtained by only substantive testing. Okay, so we also need to test those controls first. So within this planning phase of the audit engagement, we are assessing the nature, the extent, and the timing of the engagement. And when performing our sample, if we determine that the upper deviation rate is less than the overall tolerable rate, that tells us that controls are good to go. They're operating effectively. So that's going to impact our overall control risk, right? Thinking back on that audit risk formula. If our assessed control risk goes down, that means our acceptable level of detection risk is going to go up, meaning we're willing to accept more risk, which tells us we're going to have to do less work, right? Meaning we're going to perform less substantive tests. Now, if when performing this sample, we've determined that the upper deviation rate is greater than the tolerable rate, that tells us that the controls are not operating effectively, which means we need to go back to the drawing board and make some changes to the overall nature, extent, and timing of the engagement, right? Because we now have an increase to our control risk, which tells us that we have a lower overall acceptable level of detection risk, and we're now willing to accept less, which is going to mean that we're going to have to do more work by performing more substantive tests.